And now a preview of our coming attractions.
Manhole Productions presents
Derek John
and Chuck U. Farley in the South Sea Saga,
Buggery on the High Seas.
Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video we're going to be looking at 5 different games from 5 different genres and examining how all of them use comedy differently. It's going to be a little bit different because none of them are explicitly connected with one another except through their desire to make you laugh. But breaking them down for how successful they are as games and comedy games is pretty interesting. So let's get into it.
We'll start with South Park, The Stick of Truth. Stick of Truth is not the first South Park game, not by a long shot. I definitely remember the Nintendo 64 South Park game. So do many others, and not very fondly. South Park's humor has never weathered the transition from TV show to video game in years previous. The games were more about merchandising than jokes every step of the way. And, critically, they tried to translate the 2D construction paper cutout look of the show into a 3D world, where it lost much of its distinctiveness. Stick of Truth is something entirely different. It's a complete adaptation of both the art and humor of the South Park TV show, with the mechanics and pacing of a Final Fantasy-inspired game. It's a satire of games and gameplay tropes on top of being an incredibly solid extended episode of the show. It includes jokes and situations that are so outlandishly absurd, depraved, and childish that no other game would dream of including them, which is why it's such a fantastic title, and specifically, such a fantastic South Park title. When South Park first came out in 1997, it wasn't the first adult cartoon on the air, but it was the first adult cartoon to actively push the limits of what could be seen on television. The Simpsons was, and is, network comedy. South Park is cable comedy, and its influence has shaped modern pop culture in incredibly diverse ways. Its success propelled Comedy Central into the spotlight and proved the commercial viability of edgy, provocative humor. Think about when Family Guy premiered in 1999. The first season is incredibly tame by the show's later standards, but it's also incredibly tame in comparison to the South Park movie, which also debuted in 1999. The show, South Park, has always from the very beginning been about lampooning not only the specific subjects of its satire, but the fundamental concept of taking things seriously at all. And what media genre takes itself more seriously than modern games do? They have so much invested in delivering epic experiences and assuring the player that they or their character are powerful, that what they're trying to accomplish means something tangible and memorable. Stick with Truth throws that all out the window. You're not really Hero McHero Pants. This is a game. You're just playing. Playing make-believe is all gaming is, no matter how much money and math and art is poured into it. Even the most exciting, creative, and impactful experiences are in the context of you at home being entertained. Playing. To Stick of Truth, the epic plots, the complex gameplay, the incredible graphics of modern games are all pretense. A good satire does nothing better than to tear pretense to the ground. Stick of Truth is a good satire. And it's a very charismatic game on top of it. Stick of Truth was developed by veteran RPG studio Obsidian, who are the folks behind titles like Fallout New Vegas. Instead of embracing the sprawling ambitions that usually characterize an Obsidian title, Stick of Truth is very focused on faithfully adapting the TV show to the game, both visually and tonally. They nailed it on both counts. Stick of Truth relies on fixed camera points, where you move from screen to screen to navigate a mostly 2D environment. While the game retains the cutout look of the show, it's done very fluidly and packs in some great background detail, and also cleverly adds depth to the environment in charming ways. It's a little reminiscent of old-school adventure games that way, which I think was absolutely intentional. Stick of Truth makes fun of a lot of game cliches, but what games do well, the game takes the time to reference lovingly more often than not. It takes a certain amount of restraint to realize that South Park is not ultimately a fast-paced, action-packed experience, and when it is, it has no interest in impressing anybody. It's not suited for a AAA kind of game treatment. Making it more like an interactive episode of the show does better by the comedy and does better by the gameplay. The combat is turn-based, like Japanese role-playing games, but with timed defense elements when it's not your turn, button prompt attack combos when it is to keep the pacing up. Going turn-based was a brilliant idea because it allows absolutely ridiculous situations to come up and also gives you the time to laugh and appreciate their ridiculousness. In a real-time action game, you have to think about the action first. In a turn-based combat environment, there's enough time for you to get a serious laugh in when Al Gore uses a PowerPoint presentation to put your paladin to sleep. There's time to choose between the combat solution that is the best tactical option and the one that is the most hilarious option. Stick of Truth isn't just about the path to glory. it's about the path to farts. It takes time for farts. It goes on to suggest that perhaps farts are the most important aspect of the plot. Is that incredibly juvenile? Absolutely. And that's what's so likable about it. The plot continually builds towards moments of triumph and victory, and then does something gross and willfully stupid to undermine the moment. It makes you realize just how serious games take themselves to see a game like this that resolutely and gleefully rejects the very idea of a meaningful moment. Towards the climax, there's the obligatory all is lost moment, where a character wonders who could possibly become small enough to crawl up this man's ass and perform an abortion on a nuclear bomb. Why, the player, of course. Their journey has prepared them for just this moment. Stick of Truth gives you mystical kingdom-saving powers that come to the rescue in the nick of time, just like any other game. Except this time, the game deliberately undermines the idea that it should be cool mystical powers and that you should feel good about doing it. Of course, not everyone likes South Park's brand of humor, and it is certainly a very unique brand. There's a surprising amount of media scholarship on the show. The main critical objection that people have, outside of it picking on a specific person or event, is what I've seen referred to as South Park centrism or narcissistic centrism. The idea that both of any two sides of debate are equally ridiculous and wrong for caring so much, and the only genuine course of action is to do nothing and laugh. South Park puts its money where its mouth is more often than not, and has the distinction of making fun of liberal ideas and liberal activists as much as conservative ones, and often makes episodes where progressive ideas are mocked for being silly or self-promotional. There's a lot written, and written persuasively, on how South Park is fallacious as a piece of political criticism for its universal mockery. I agree, but that's missing the point entirely. While it contains political criticism, there's no getting away from the fact that this is a deliberately provocative comedy from two of Hollywood's most successful provocateurs. Offense is the intent. If you feel like the show has gone too far, it is functioning as intended. An episode of South Park is not an act of criticism or of scholarship. It is an instance of attempted comedy. The success of the comedy largely revolves around if an individual audience member takes the subject of the satire seriously or not. Audiences are made fun of for taking anything seriously as much as anyone or anything that appears in the show itself. Many of the criticisms leveled against the show are pretty legitimate, regarding being insensitive and outrageous. They're also spitting against the wind as far as the humor is concerned. South Park is one of the more influential pieces of modern pop culture, but it is still the principal product of two dudes writing and producing what those two dudes will find funny, and what any individual episode contains will never be more or less than that. Parker and Stone put in what makes them laugh. Self-serious people being portrayed as ridiculous and inept always makes them laugh, regardless of the actual motivations and accomplishments and histories of those people. So, Stick of Truth does predictably provocative things, but in ways that are so childish and ridiculous that it's hard to find any real offense. You perform an interactive abortion at gunpoint in this game. You do it on Randy Marsh's butt while he's wearing a wig. A child witnesses his parents having sex while he shrunk down to inches tall and fighting a gnome wizard. Eventually, the clash between the kid and the wizard moves on to the parents' bed, and their sex becomes an environmental hazard during the fight. South Park: The Stick of Truth is the only game ever where there is a short quick-time event for ducking under your dad's balls as they pendulously swing across the linen battlefield. Games have always been one of the most remarkable media formats for exploring the exotic and the incredible, for portraying scenes that couldn't easily be done by movies and TV. Stick of Truth is part of that tradition, the most willfully, gleefully gross part of that tradition that I ever did see. Of course, in addition to the highly successful envelope-pushing humor, there's also the show's traditional subject satire. Nothing's left untouched. The frame of the game is that the South Park kids are fighting a pretend epic battle between the elves, led by Kyle, and the humans, led by Cartman. The game starts this way, framing your epic quest just like any other epic fantasy, but then having you, in actuality, go door to door bothering people and stealing their underwear and sports equipment. Then, your first night in town, you're abducted by aliens. There's a probe moment so crazy explicit that I'm shocked that they were able to put it in the game. Another success, according to the values of the show. And then there's also audio logs for that portion, which is probably one of my favorite jokes in the game. The logs become increasingly hilarious as the narrator begins to wonder why he's bothering to record them for people at all. It's a solid takedown of one of gaming's oldest storytelling tropes. Then, the flying saucer crashes and toxic sludge leaks out, turning the townsfolk into Nazi zombies. Like, with little armbands and everything. Characters frequently complain how tired everyone is of Nazi zombies. Your character learns magic from Cartman. Magic in the form of farts. It's your dragon shout, just like Skyrim. It even functions the same. but, from your butt and junk. It's very easy to say, oh, fart humor? Please, I'm a grown-up now, I have a briefcase, and I worry about insurance and everything. But there's something incredibly satisfying about seeing the things which games construct as epic and empowering time and time again get the legs knocked out from under them by this kind of grade school humor. You could do a more insightful, cutting satire of gameplay tropes. It's totally possible. South Park gets to the heart of the joke a hell of a lot quicker with its base approach, though, and does an amazingly fluid and charismatic job of it. You're the big hero, most games say. You're the big... Now say from Stick of Truth says. It fills the same entertainment niche in gaming today that the show did when it premiered in '97, providing a reliably, hysterically gross and outrageous counterpoint to an ocean of narrative tropes that often flow by unnoticed. It's an uncommonly successful adaptation of a very unique style of television comedy. It's ambitious, but it could be more ambitious. What happens when you try to make a game that adapts an entire subculture for comedic effect? Where the mythical struggles and empowering violence of games made it an ideal subject for satire in the South Park game, it has a more genuine and straightforward resonance with the music and creative values of heavy metal. Metal has always had an influence in game design. The album covers of classic metal look like they were always meant to be video games. Gruesome detail, grand and bloody struggles, mountains of skulls and rivers of fire. They are part of a very distinct aesthetic that birthed an equally distinct subculture. One that, while quietly influencing game design for years, had never been explicitly credited for the influence or explored in its totality by a game until 2009's Brutal Legend. To actually adapt the feel of a Megadeth album cover was going to yield an over-the-top result if you're actually trying to make an hours-long narrative revolve around it. Tim Schafer, one of the most visible adventure game designers in the development field, and head honcho of Double Fine Productions, went all in on the ridiculousness. Brutal Legend would be about a roadie, a good roadie, who can't stand what passes for metal these days. One of the stupid kids in the band he's working for takes a fall, and Eddie, the protagonist, sacrifices himself to save him. This sacrifice awakens Omegodron, the fire god, who just happens to look like Motorhead Snaggletooth, who sends Eddie back in time, way back, to a world where chaos and evil rule the land and only one power can save the world. The power of rock. There was only ever one choice for a voice actor who would play Eddie, and thank God he said yes to the role. Jack Black, frontman for Tenacious D, serious rocker, and slapstick comedy superstar. Where Stone and Parker brought their distinctive humor into their game, Black would bring his own brand of humor into this game. I actually assumed that he was more creatively involved in the script until I read that it was mostly Schafer's vision that you see in Brutal Legend. It fits Black's style of comedy and rhythm of comedy to an absolute T. And, like Stick of Truth, it uses well-worn tropes and gameplay expectations to prop up its jokes and hold the game itself together. As a game, Brutal Legend is much more ambitious than Stick of Truth. It suffers some from that ambition. Stick of Truth's clarity in what kind of game it would be based on faithful adaptation of the show was its greatest design value. Brutal Legend has no comedy roadmap like Stick of Truth. It's adapting a style and aesthetic that's traditionally based in music, art, and fashion. All three of these things are present in the game and faithfully reflect the aesthetic, along with a lot more that the game maybe didn't need. Brutal Legend has an extensive open world, which you travel around via a mystical hot rod that you slowly upgrade as the game progresses. So far, so good. The open world is one of the best things about Brutal Legend. It's a short game at a relatively small world, but it's packed to the limits with genuinely striking and fantastical vistas. There's a mountain range that is a miles-long wall of speakers and amps. There's deserts where chrome tailpipes thrust from the ground like cactus, jungles with cats that shoot lasers from their eyes. The game's short length and fast pace make it seem all the more endearing and spectacular. There's so much to see, and you see it so fast that nothing wears out its welcome. In many ways, Brutal Legend is all about the environmental details. They truly did want to create a whole world ripped right from heavy metal album covers, and then wanted to fill it with explicit and subtle nods to the long and exciting history of metal music and fandom. Divisions in the metal fan base are the basis for how the plot advances and who your enemies are, from General Lionwhite and his hair metal glam rock army, who have many of the same units but kitted out in purple cheetah print, to Ophelia's army of goth monsters. It takes the fashions, the subcultures, and the music, and blends them all into a mythical reframing of the whole genre. This is capital letter metal, as told by the artistic self-concept of metal. This makes it a really remarkable piece of media, quite unlike any other game in its setting and in its light-hearted tone. Where Stick of Truth was a game that undermined its epic moments, Brutal Legend finds its humor in dialing up the epic flavor to heavily stylized and ridiculous proportions, and then adding in all of these outside music references. Brutal Legend is a game that seeks to delight rather than to tear down. It loves its source material, and is giving it a wildly creative new expression rather than relying on satire or parody. It's what makes it a more unique game, but it also makes it less laugh-out-loud funny than Stick of Truth. It's a straight-up comedy, with a linear narrative and a climax that takes itself somewhat seriously. Most of the jokes are based around dialogue rather than the game world itself. Eddie's a consistently hilarious character, and almost the entire supporting cast is voiced with an equal amount of competence and enthusiasm. All the jokes are in there, in the script and in the character design. The game world itself is much more invested in its visual aesthetic than in laughter. It's a prioritization that works well. Ultimately, Brutal Legend only has two problems that keep it from being a top-notch comedy and game, respectively. The trouble with the comedy is that over time it begins to take its own plot and characters more and more seriously, so that by the time that you get to the end, there aren't a whole lot of jokes going on anymore. This is a problem that's very typical to Hollywood comedies, where many movies that have a strong current of humor flowing through the first couple of acts gets diverted by the third act's need to draw the story to a close. Brutal Legend, as a straightforward comedy that takes its mandate to be epic quite seriously, was always at risk of getting caught up in itself. Of course, this would be a lot worse if the characters weren't for the most part pretty damn good. All the characters have cartoony, exaggerated features that make them incredibly expressive, and when you couple that with the amazing voice work from actual metal legends like Lemmy Kilmister, Ozzy Osbourne, and Lita Ford, alongside Jack Black and others, there's no way not to get caught up in the story yourself unless you find the whole thing categorically too ridiculous or somehow don't like rock music. Licensed tracks, really fucking awesome and classic licensed metal tracks, play not only while driving around, but during specific action sequences, which soundtrack themselves incredibly well. There's pretty much always some rocking out to be done. Eddie even uses a guitar for magic and special abilities. The game takes special care to make the action also about the music. It's a gameplay element that makes sense and is incorporated elegantly. But that's not the whole of combat in the game. Which brings us to the second problem, the awkwardly executed real-time strategy elements. Fully the first half of the game is a pretty regular third-person hack-and-slash game with some elements of light unit control and, of course, the open-world driving. But at the halfway mark, your battle reaches the threshold. A literal army has come to Bladehenge, and you'll have to fight it off, with your own army. This is the first stage battle. You set up a stage, they set up a stage, and then you harness the power of fans, rising in geysers through the earth, by building and defending merch booths. Meanwhile, build your army and destroy the enemy. It's not the first third-person real-time strategy game, but it is not the most smooth either. As the game goes on toward its climax, the complexity of the encounters ramps up correspondingly. By the time you're fighting the final two missions, you're either being actively challenged by the real-time strategy systems and having a good time, or tearing your hair out because you didn't actually mean to play an RTS, and was here mostly for the medal. The thing is, with an action game, lower difficulties smooth things out for players who aren't very good or are really interested in the challenge, and let it cruise along just fine. For a lighthearted, easygoing game like this, that's a good rhythm. The strategy portions demand that you learn their systems pretty well, inside and out, even on easier difficulties. Except that the game does a very poor job of teaching you how to coordinate these systems in the RTS. You're introduced to each unit through a story mission, but in terms of coordinating your troops and resources, a player is mostly on their own. I liked the RTS elements. I liked the idea of it, and I liked the way the crazy units populated the battlefield, but it is awkward as hell to actually manage, and there's just no way around that. Brutal Legend is a fast-paced, chaotic froth of ideas and images that works more often than it doesn't. In this case, it doesn't. But if you don't like that, there's a dozen other different kinds of missions and minigames to play. It's a winningly charismatic chaos that way. It's as remarkable an active adaptation as Stick of Truth, more so, really, when you consider what a diverse set of influences ended up making it into the game. It's not strictly necessary for games to look outside themselves for comedic influence, though. This next game, Far Cry Blood Dragon, a standalone expansion for Far Cry 3, is every bit as over-the-top ridiculous as Brutal Legend, almost more so in parts, but without any of that character development nonsense. It's a really strange little shooter. It's designed as a retro-influenced take on 1980s arcade and home arcade values. If Contra was given a modern retelling, this would be close. It even uses the same kind of funky pixel block illustration of the NES era to do its storytelling cutscenes. And, crucially, they brought in none other than Michael Biehn, who starred in the original Terminator and also in Aliens to do voice work. Like when Jack Black was chosen for Brutal Legend, Biehn was a perfect fit for Blood Dragon's intended style. He knows exactly how to make 80s-influenced one-liners sound authentic, having himself delivered many of the great one-liners of the 80s. You play, and he voices Rex Power Colt, one of the last of the Cyber Commandos, as he attempts to prevent Sloan, his former Cyber Commando commander, from nuking the world so that man can return to a state of primal violence. fights. Also, there are big dinosaurs called the Blood Dragons from which Sloane draws power. Together with the esteemed Dr. Darling, you must establish control of the island and stop the missiles. And the dinosaurs. And don't forget to get all the collectibles. Like Stick of Truth, it has disdain for the very idea that you would take it seriously. Unlike Stick of Truth, it's interested in celebrating rather than lampooning the ridiculousness of its inspiration. Blood Dragon really does feel like a DirectX 10 version of an old arcade cabinet. It certainly has moments of regular parody, where it goes after modern games, like an unskippable tutorial that explicitly bombards and irritates the player with useless information and insipid demands, but primarily, it's a nostalgia trip, as seen through the lens of modern game design. From a practical perspective, Blood Dragon is just a very short, streamlined version of Far Cry 3. It doesn't really play very differently, just swapping out skill trees for challenge-based advancement. It has regenerating health, aim down the sights, vehicles you can drive, and barrels you can make explode. All of the charm and the humor come from the fact that it laments the kind of bizarre, meaningless, colorful experiences of games past, while at the same time incorporating all the modern touches. Like all nostalgia trips, it's not entirely grounded in a historical reality, but also like any good nostalgia trip, it taps into a vein of widespread sentiment, in this instance about how games used to be when you looked at them with fresher eyes. Serious Sam is another backwards-looking shooter, but Serious Sam is exactly the same kind of game as 90s corridor shooters in a structural way, not just in aesthetics or presentation. Blood Dragon is very unlike any of the games from which it draws inspiration in terms of design. It's a Far Cry game, and a recent one at that. Yet the difference in gameplay between its inspiration and the execution makes the comedic nostalgia much more keenly felt. As a game, it's responsive, vivid, well laid out, and compulsively playable. It aims to be fun at all times, and it succeeds very consistently. It highlights, in its playing, what's actually nice about modern games, their smoothness and their capacity for visual splendor. In exchange, we've also gotten production bloat and the kind of self-seriousness that Stick of Truth was so keen to mock. Back in the day, smaller games from smaller studios could do literally whatever they wanted, so the nostalgic thinking goes anyway, no matter if it made sense or not. Those were the days of all your base or belong to us, make your time. There was, and this part is true, a tangible and anarchic sense of taking pleasure in nonsense. Before graphics could meaningfully convey the vistas of imaginary worlds, much of the imagination went into trying to figure out how to make the little dots and bloops on the screen compelling anyway. It's a challenge. Nonsense helped developers cope with technical limitations by letting them invent literally any explanation for exotic gameplay concepts and have it pass. There was no expectation of competition with the narratives of page or screen. It is demonstrably different now. Not only is the respect for nonsense gone, so is the business demand for nonsense. Mostly, Blood Dragon provides a vivid illustration of what modern games would look like if they retained that freewheeling disregard for sense and internal consistency that early games characterized. In terms of actual jokes, Blood Dragon has the least of them out of the games we've talked about so far. It's still very funny, but more intermittently, in between moments of gameplay. The comedic tone that carries throughout the entire game persists and adds light humorous elements to every encounter, but it is an action game. The action comes before the jokes and in preference to them. Except for the end. Blood Dragon's got a knockout ending for a comedy game. First, you must travel to an alternate dimension where a series of arena fights with each main weapon in the game, one after another, will prove you are the ultimate warrior, and bestow upon you the kill star, like a laser gun version of the thing from Krull. Of course, you'll have to learn how to use it, which is why you have a training montage, and then it's off to storm the castle with the kill star, and then ride a dinosaur with laser eyes and get your victory / revenge / whatever. It's a game that uses modern techniques to long for the time before such sophistications. And for Blood Dragon, it works great. You don't have to make a smart first-person game to make a hilarious first-person game. But let's suppose you do make an extremely smart one. It doesn't take much supposin to start figuring that Portal 2 is the game I'm talking about. It's just about one of the most intelligently and elegantly designed first-person puzzlers ever made. Many people will tell you it's one of the best games, full stop. Many, many more people will tell you that it is one of the funniest games ever. They're right, on both counts. Its success stems from the fact that Portal 2 is exactly the kind of game that Blood Dragon was lamenting the loss of, a game that places equal value on absurdity and creativity. The first Portal pioneered the style of puzzles and presentation you see in the second, and the second game is more of an expansion on those ideas than a reinvention of them. They don't need reinventing. The first Portal was close to perfect, the sleeper hit of the orange box. The second is bigger and more in every way, 4 times as long, filled with multiple characters, new mechanics, and gorgeous surreal architecture. It incorporates the kind kind of production bloat that hinders creativity in other titles, but instead of taking the mandate to be bigger as a mandate to be awesome and cool in the way a Mountain Dew advertisement would interpret it, it's unbelievably thoughtful with the increased production values. A lot of people would argue that it isn't a comedy game exactly. There's a lot going on in Portal 2, tonally and thematically. It's a game that performs well on many different levels, but the comedy is what makes it so distinctive, what makes Portal 2 one of the best games of all time, period, and not just one of the best puzzle games of all time. The comedy is used to craft the atmosphere, it's used to explore the darker themes, and it's used in a scientific context. Portal 2 is an absurdist dark comedy. Such a good one that you half expect Eugene Ionesco to show up in the credits. Portal 2 is much, much more than just its puzzles. It's more than just its comedy, too, but the two are intertwined so masterfully that you could never separate one from the other in the game. One of the most prominent differences between this game and the last is the setting. In the first Portal, the Aperture facility was huge and long abandoned, but while many things were fantastical, it still felt somewhat grounded. At the end of the game, your character is dragged back down into the facility after making your escape. You begin the second game by preparing to go into some kind of stasis sleep. You wake up an impossibly long amount of time later, what looks like closer to hundreds or thousands of years later. It's impossible to tell with any certainty. Portal 2 is very loose in what makes sense and what doesn't, in a very classically absurdist way. In Portal 2, both time and space behave nonsensically, but in a way that somehow feels internally consistent in its ridiculousness. The Aperture facility is not only huge, it is physics and reason-defyingly huge. Some parts are extremely decayed, some parts are remarkably well preserved. Throughout, the architecture is a mix of the mundane and the surreal. It's a little unsettling, and makes it pretty close to impossible to tell what directions the game will go in. The anything, and anything can happen, is significantly increased when the world itself has no interest in conforming to realism. And it isn't like any of the other games we've discussed so far, where distortions of reality are for satirical purposes. Here, the absurdist elements serve to keep the player off balance, holding danger and death in an unpredictable balance with wonder and delight. The Aperture facility in Portal 2 is the kind of thing that can really only be adequately conveyed by an interactive medium like games. It builds the player's impression of the place slowly over hours of play, through many different aspects and aesthetics of the facility. It's an understanding based on exploration and curiosity. A passive medium like film couldn't create curious engagement with the environment like the puzzles in the game can. A static composition like a painting can't convey the depth and extent of the thing like a long game can. And a stage play, or even a live-action movie, could never, ever demonstrate environmental absurdity on the sheer scale that Portal 2 accomplishes it. It is such a good game, partly because it's really taking advantage of its structure and its medium so creatively. It's taking the mechanics and elevating them into something much more comprehensively artistic. It goes almost without saying that only a game could have something as uniquely engaging and scientifically impossible as portal puzzles. The base mechanic sounds simple. Shoot a door entrance with one button, shoot a door exit with another to navigate an intensely hostile series of test chambers and the spaces in between. The execution is very complex, though, and Portal 2 introduces a whole heap of secondary mechanics to vary the play even more. Just like in the first game, the goal of many test chambers is genuinely instructional, to slowly teach a player new ways to solve puzzles, and then to incorporate all of the tricks they've taught you into tricky combinations by the end of the game. Portal 2 is a game that doesn't require a difficulty level. You either learn the mechanic, or you're stuck until you figure it out. Once you learn it, it's yours forever. Absolutely everything about the game is so charming, so memorable, and the satisfaction of solving puzzles is so great that there's no way to forget what it teaches you. That's also part of why it's so universally beloved, and not just beloved by puzzle enthusiasts. It's not only a unique concept, it's a concept that teaches itself to you without holding your hand, condescending, or even explicitly mentioning that you're being taught as you go along. A part of that is that each test chamber incorporates a little bit of classic behavioral conditioning, positive reinforcement accomplished through jokes. Pavlov taught his dogs to salivate when a bell would ring by making them associate the bell with food. Hear the bell, receive food. Portal 2 is digital, but it still has a way to literally trigger your brain's pleasure centers when you solve a task, by making you laugh every time you do. There are other factors at play, curiosity about the facility, the pleasure of solving the puzzles, but in a real and demonstrable way, comedy is being used in this instance in a genuinely scientific context. It's a humorous game about science using science humorously and humor scientifically. Solve test, receive joke. Salivate when the orange checkmark lights up. The test chambers themselves are pretty cunningly designed as well. They're only outmatched by the puzzles that take place in between the test chambers, who use the same mechanics as the test chambers, but without quite so many of the environmental hints and symbols. It's not a game solely about test chambers and jokes, either. The final and perhaps most surprising key to its success is that it's not just an absurdist dark comedy first-person puzzle platformer, it's one with a spectacular ensemble cast. The first game was Chell, the silent protagonist, and GLaDOS, the AI who controls the test chambers. In the first game, it was only slowly revealed that GLaDOS was a sentient machine, and not only sentient, but petty and cruel. It was a fantastic switch. Here, you don't immediately begin with GLaDOS. She's been junk on the floor for decades upon decades. Instead, you're woken by Wheatley, an AI core like the ones you knocked out of GLaDOS during the boss fight at the end of the game. Wheatley is friendly, well-intentioned, and hilariously incompetent. The opposite of GLaDOS. The first few test chambers are administered by an automated proctor, just canned voice announcements, not a real AI, but the one-liners are still fantastic and incredible, and even help expand the setting in quiet ways, like an announcement cheerfully welcoming the tribal remnants of whatever remains of society outside the facility to the testing experience. It implores them to be mindful of the paperwork aspects of testing. Eventually, you and Wheatley come back around to GLaDOS' chamber at the heart of the facility. All Wheatley has to do is flip the switch for the elevator to the surface. He makes a slight catastrophic mistake, flips all the switches, and turns GLaDOS back on instead. And she could not be more delighted to see you. Now, it's not just a relationship between test administrator and test subject. Now, it's a catty rivalry between two women of science, played out across the miles and miles and miles of tubes and lights and experiments. In Portal 2, this time it's personal. But, actually, just as in Half-Life 2 with Gordon and his friends, Valve found ways to convey surprisingly huge amounts of depth and emotion with a protagonist who never actually speaks. Part of it is that GLaDOS isn't just the villain. She's the villain for a long, long time in the game and tries to kill you repeatedly, sometimes coming extremely close to success. But you swap her out for Wheatley in terms of who controls the facility. And Wheatley's your friend, right? He brings the elevator to the surface down for you. But in the game's most remarkable and memorable scene, Wheatley's exhilaration and empowerment at suddenly ruling over the literally impossible vastness of the facility turns dark. What's a test facility without test subjects? Do you have to leave right now? He punishes GLaDOS by binding her to a potato battery, and when she insults him to the maximum of her operational ability as a potato, he gets mad. Real mad, and smashes you into the ground, down into what pretty much amounts to a bottomless pit. It's an amazingly well-done moment. The balance of triumph and betrayal, the shifts in character and emotion, they're all so fluid and work so well for all the characters involved. Portal 2 just keeps those moments rolling. This next section is my favorite, and represents some pretty genius moments in environmental storytelling. At the bottom of the pit lies the original long-abandoned test chambers for the facility. You begin in the 1950s-era chambers, where Cave Johnson, founder and CEO, once brought the elite of society to challenge themselves with science and learning and non-consensual radioactive bombardment. It's the Aperture way. It's mad science, but it's mad science you can't stay mad at. These labs, these tests, they're always trying to kill you, but the peril isn't real, of course. It's as distorted and exaggerated as the architecture, and used to the same effect, inspiring curiosity and then tempering it with danger. When you work your way up the spheres, you get to the 1970s chambers, where things have taken a turn for the worse. Aperture is no longer fashionable. They're bribing the homeless with $60 to run through the tests. Johnson berates and belittles his subjects through the announcements. The only thing that he still seems enthusiastic about is the science and Catherine, his assistant. When you work your way up to the 1990s labs, Johnson's mad science has caught up with him, and he's dying. He only has one regret, that he didn't invest in computers sooner. He's working on a thinking computer, and when he dies, he wants Catherine to run the place. They can put her in the computer, whether she wants to or not. And suddenly, there it is. Why is GLaDOS so hateful? From where does her love of science and disdain for human scientists spring? Right there, included subtly enough that you start to figure it out long before the game makes it explicit. GLaDOS was once a real human woman of science. Now she's an immortal machine whose sole purpose is to test and test and test and test. All her hatred and bitterness has a valid basis. All the murder? Maybe a slightly excessive response on her part, but it doesn't matter. The player and Shell have found something human and sympathetic within GLaDOS, and it's harder for GLaDOS to hate you having shared that moment of mutual recognition. Fitting something so heartfelt into a game so surreal and crazy is a tricky proposition, but Valve nailed it. When you finally make it back to the modern facility, Wheatley has run it into the ground. He's tried to mix the boxes and the turrets into these sad little creatures, the power plant is about to explode, and he's feeling the itch to test. Wheatley's actually a more dangerous villain than GLaDOS, and his chambers are more dangerous because of his prideful incompetence. The first chambers he comes up with are laughably simple and feature level design features that are deliberately amateurish, like writing words on the wall and lights, something that real people who are messing around with level design for the first time are likely to do. His chambers don't satisfy the need to test, though, so he uses some of GLaDOS's old chambers, which she kept, filled with skeletons, for sentimental reasons. Wheatley smashes them together, so while every test has a solution, the solution is an amalgamation of broken-off pieces of puzzles that would make more sense separate than together. His levels are dangerously bad, and also quite difficult to puzzle out for that reason. In this way, level design is also character development, which I have never seen before or since. Each proctor's personality is expressed through their test chambers. GLaDOS has elegant, cunning, cleverly designed puzzles. Cave Johnson has industrial, clunky, adventurous puzzles. Wheatley tries his best, and his best is a goddamn mess, a jagged hodgepodge of everything you've seen so far. The more he fails, the more frustrated and angry he gets. At you, the test taker. The contrast between Wheatley at the beginning of the game and at the end is a little terrifying, but he's very much the same personality. You just never should have given him power. So there's a big and hilarious boss fight just like at the end of the original Portal, but even more chaotic and surprising. You put GLaDOS back in charge. After what the two of you went through, you're not exactly enemies anymore. There's a moment where it looks like you might be friends. And then she immediately deletes the lesson that she learned, and it looks like she'll try to kill you again, but she doesn't. She wants to do science in peace. She lets you go. Even the turrets let you go. They sing for you as you leave. You did save them, after all, from Wheatley. Then the elevator reaches the surface, and there's nothing. Fields of brown grass swaying gently in the breeze. Seeing the sky feels like such an incredible triumph at that point. It's a fantastic climax any way you look at it. Portal 2 is every bit as creative as Brutal Legend, in some ways much, much more so, but it is infinitely more consistent in its humor and mechanics as well. Nothing is included in Portal 2 that doesn't contribute to the whole. Each second of the game works, and works well, both as game and as comedy, and seldom functioning as one without also functioning as the other. It's a painstakingly crafted, absurdist masterpiece. But not every absurdist game even aspires to be a masterpiece. Goat Simulator was never meant to really be a retail game in the first place. It was conceived of as a slap-together joke project for a game jam, which is when developers get together to make short games for fun, not profit. But people liked the idea. You're a goat, and you lick stuff, and headbutt other stuff, and chaotic mayhem ensues thanks to a twitchy, broken physics system that really turns a sandwich into a banquet as far as the hilarity is concerned. You can do other goat stuff, too. You can bleat, and people will look. You can wear jetpacks and ride bicycles. That's goat stuff, right? It advertises itself as the latest in goat simulation technology. Portal 2 was absurdism as art. This is absurdism as a toy. Goat Simulator really is, if you can get it for a few dollars, a consistently hilarious piece of software. Everything about it is dopey, wacky, nonsensical, and deliberately half-assed. The developers said they took their inspiration from skateboarding games, where you cruise around a map looking for combos and hidden challenges. So too in Goat Simulator, except the combos come from time spent flying through the air, walking on walls, headbutting things, and generally ruining people's afternoons. It's great. As much chaos and as many explosions as you cause, no one dies, and their reaction is always indignation. I go into a person's house, lick the dinner table, wreck the entire house, and then that person gets up and declares, "Well, I never." Where the previous games we've discussed all relied on scripted humor, Goat Simulator is an open-ended sandbox, and an incredibly cheap, hastily thrown-together sandbox at that. It knows it. That's the point. Goat Simulator is just about the purest experience of pointlessly fucking around in a video game I've ever seen. It captures in the present what Blood Dragon looked to the past for, a game that doesn't care if it makes sense because it found a mechanic that's fun, and that, however outlandish its flaws, the more endearing it was. Goat Simulator has received consistent updates, too. They added a seaside boardwalk map, an MMO map, and a paid DLC making fun of survival horror. You get the idea of Goat Simulator pretty well from the base game, though, and the more effort they put into these expansions, the less genuinely ridiculous it seems. It's more calculated humor, and Goat Simulator is on the furthest end of the joke spectrum away from that. Its success is partly due to the fact that although ridiculous nonsense games don't sell as many copies as games that, try a little harder, there is a massive demand for hilarious nonsense here on YouTube. Games like Goat Simulator function like comedy generators for Let's Players, who take the wild and wonky gameplay and then add in their own flavor of jokey commentary on top of it. Goat Simulator is pretty much as fun to watch as it is to play. Nothing is really lost in being a spectator. And if you like the commentator's style of humor, then you've got pretty much a can't-lose scenario. I don't always fully understand the appeal of extensive Let's Plays of long games, but I do see the appeal of short comedy generators like this one. No two people will goat the same, and the feeling of laughing with someone at the same things, even if one of those people is pre-recorded, is tangible fun. It's like how sitcoms use laugh tracks, except genuine in this case. Goat Simulator is a game that's probably going to crack a person up pretty tough unless they're extremely serious people who don't find the fundamental idea of obnoxious goat nonsense appealing. The laughs that Let's Players share with their audience are more spontaneous and warm than much of what you'll find on television. There are a number of professional reviews of Goat Simulator that try to take it seriously as a piece of software and find it wanting, but none of them account for the appeal of Goat Simulator as a shared experience. It's a party game, even if you're a party of one. The reviewers who weren't impressed by Goat Simulator called this hype and felt misdirected by it. It isn't hype, it's an in-joke. These reviewers are outside the joke, so of course it's a buggy mess from that perspective. A buggy mess is what Goat Simulator is intentionally and explicitly. And like every game in this survey, it uses humor in a way that's pretty unique to what games as a media format are able to accomplish. The kind of outlandish messing around on display in Goat Simulator would be impossible outside of maybe cartoons, and even then you wouldn't have the thrill of setting up the fall, spills, and explosions yourself. Goat Simulator is a terrible game, but an excellent comedy game. It accomplishes its goal completely. I laughed. I laughed a lot. There's a million different ways and 100 different genres to make people laugh with games, but in each instance we looked at so far, a successful comedy game will manifest its humor in ways that take advantage of the on-bound, elastic creativity of the medium. So while most games feel like if they cost millions of dollars to make, they should take themselves seriously, some of the most creative expressions come from games who refuse to do so. Games can do anything at all. Why don't more of them try to make you laugh? Thanks for watching.
I'd like to take the time now to thank some of the people who are currently supporting me through the crowdfunding website Patreon. Pretty much everything about my channel is currently supported through crowdfunding, so if you like what I'm doing and want to contribute, that would be the best way that you could possibly help me. In the meantime, I'd like to thank by name some of the people who are currently supporting me at $10 a month or over. And that includes Jonathan Fleichner, Nobody, Sil, Sangusta, Ryan Guntz, Brad Wallace, Connor Biblo, Kumaran Vijayan, Chocolate Cake, Annex of Rhodes, Niels Bach-Frummer, Spyro Sedaris, Kevin DeBolt, Rob Clark, Matthew Lagden, Harlan McAvoy, Valentin Selesnyov, Jared Leitmiller, Michael Gillis, Brandon, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Richard Williams, Jack Painta, Tizer Vikarin, Cassie Bayer, Christian Zachariasen, Soeb Sheik, Pat Hay, Yuri Petnis, White Zero, Espen Steinsnes, Irvin, William Kreusch, Joshua Hartnett, Oliver Handlikin, Joe Wolf, Kimmo Heikkinen, Stefan Persson, Richard Stevenson, Jonas Neef, Sakan Sealealu, Jonas Rack, Stephen Lark, Preston Allen, Daniel Zooks, Signe Jensen, Ken Young, Dalton Seiler, Doi Nguyen, Daniel Reeder, Jared Meyer, Justin Hughes, Aidan Kennedy, Florence Sabau, Chris, Josh Farkas, Ivan Martinoff, Jake Brennan, Brad Carr, Colin, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Andreas Larson, Finn Spencer, Adam Shelley, Devin Knoll, Martin Scanning, Brett Giamo, Galak, and Chris Roslido. Thanks again for watching, and thanks again for contributing.
Time to choose between the combat solution that is the best tactical option and the one that is the most hilarious option. Stick of Truth isn't just about the path to glory. It's about the path to farts. It takes time for farts. It goes on to suggest that perhaps farts are the most important aspect of the plot. Is that incredibly juvenile? Absolutely. And that's what's so likable about it. The plot continually builds towards moments of triumph and victory, and then does something gross and willfully stupid to undermine the moment. It makes you realize just how serious games take themselves to see a game like this that resolutely and gleefully rejects the very idea of a meaningful moment. Towards the climax, there's the obligatory all is lost moment, where a character wonders who could possibly become small enough to crawl up this man's ass and perform an abortion on a nuclear bomb. Why, the player, of course. Their journey has prepared them for just this moment. Stick of Truth gives you mystical kingdom-saving powers that come to the rescue in the nick of time, just like any other game. Except this time, the game deliberately undermines the idea that it should be cool mystical powers and that you should feel good about doing it. Of course, not everyone likes South Park. Different. It's a complete adaptation of both the art and humor of the South Park TV show, with the mechanics and pacing of a Final Fantasy-inspired game. It's a satire of games and gameplay tropes on top of being an incredibly solid extended episode of the show. It includes jokes and situations that are so outlandishly absurd, depraved, and childish that no other game would dream of including them, which is why it's such a fantastic title, and specifically, such a fantastic South Park title. When South Park first came out in 1997, it wasn't the first adult cartoon on the air, but it was the first adult cartoon to actively push the limits of what could be seen on television. The Simpsons was, and is, network comedy. South Park is cable comedy, and its influence has shaped modern pop culture in incredibly diverse ways. Its success propelled Comedy Central into the spotlight and proved the commercial viability of edgy, provocative humor. Think about when Family Guy premiered in 1999. The first season is incredibly tame by the show's later standards, but it's also incredibly tame in comparison to the South Park movie, which also debuted in 1999. The show, South Park, has always from the very beginning been about lampooning not only the specific subjects of its satire, but the fundamental concept of taking things seriously at all. And what media genre takes itself more seriously than modern games do? They have so much invested in delivering epic experiences and assuring the player that they or their character are powerful, that what they're trying to accomplish means something tangible and memorable. Stick with Truth throws that all out the window. You're not really Hero McHero Pants. This is a game. You're just playing. Playing make-believe is all gaming is, no matter how much money and math and art is poured into it. Even the most exciting, creative, and impactful experiences are in the context of you at home being entertained, playing. To Stick of Truth, the epic plots, the complex gameplay, the incredible graphics of modern games are all pretense. A good satire does nothing better than to tear pretense to the ground. Stick of Truth is a good satire. And it's a very charismatic game on top of it. Stick of Truth was developed by veteran RPG studio Obsidian, who are the folks behind titles like Fallout New Vegas. Instead of embracing the sprawling ambitions that usually characterize an Obsidian title, Stick of Truth is very focused on faithfully adapting the TV show to the game, both visually and tonally. They nailed it on both counts. Stick of Truth relies on fixed camera points, where you move from screen to screen to...
And now a preview of our coming attractions.
Manhole Productions presents
Tarik John
and Chuck U. Farley in the South Sea Saga,
Buggery on the High Seas.
Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video we're going to be looking at 5 different games from 5 different genres and examining how all of them use comedy differently. It's going to be a little bit different because none of them are explicitly connected with one another except through their desire to make you laugh. But breaking them down for how successful they are as games and comedy games is pretty interesting. So let's get into it.
We'll start with South Park, the Stick of Truth. Stick of Truth is not the first South Park game, not by a long shot. I definitely remember the Nintendo 64 South Park game. So do many others, and not very fondly. South Park's humor has never weathered the transition from TV show to video game in years previous. The games were more about merchandising than jokes every step of the way. And, critically, they tried to translate the 2D construction paper cutout look of the show into a 3D world, where it lost much of its distinctiveness. Stick of Truth is something entirely to navigate a mostly 2D environment. While the game retains the cutout look of the show, it's done very fluidly and packs in some great background detail, and also cleverly adds depth to the environment in charming ways. It's a little reminiscent of old-school adventure games that way, which I think was absolutely intentional. Stick of Truth makes fun of a lot of game cliches, but what games do well, the game takes the time to reference lovingly more often than not. It takes a certain amount of restraint to realize that South Park is not ultimately a fast-paced, action-packed experience, and when it is, it has no interest in impressing anybody. It's not suited for a AAA kind of game treatment. Making it more like an interactive episode of the show does better by the comedy and does better by the gameplay. Combat is turn-based, like Japanese role-playing games, but with timed defense elements when it's not your turn, button prompt attack combos when it is to keep the pacing up. Going turn-based was a brilliant idea because it allows absolutely ridiculous situations to come up and also gives you the time to laugh and appreciate their ridiculousness. In a real-time action game, you have to think about the action first. In a turn-based combat environment, there's enough time for you to get a serious laugh in when Al Gore uses a PowerPoint presentation to put your paladin to sleep. There's time